I'm Dr. Jim Calvert. I'm a clinical psychologist and a teaching professor at Southern Methodist University. And I teach a course on psychology of evil. And in fact, one of my other videos was all about the top 10 reasons people become evil. But one of the really big questions that I always get is, what's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? So what I have here for you is kind of an outline of which you'll often find on the internet and different places about kind of outlining the two. But one of the problems that we have with these definitions is that there really isn't a great one for it. So what I want to do is I want to take us through what is the kind of thought about the difference between the two, and then talk about whether there really is a difference, because there's a lot of researchers who believe there is no difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. Okay. Psychopath as a term actually goes back further than sociopath. Sociopath is the newer term for it. And it kind of came about with the idea that maybe there are some people who act in antisocial ways, but are not totally lacking in a conscience. They may have some connections with others, or perhaps their psychopathology, that antisocial behavior, actually developed because they were embedded in a group of people or in a community or in a situation that brought that out, as opposed to being born with it. But as we'll look at it, that idea of being born with it is not that easy of an explanation, even though that's one of the more common ones for a psychopath, meaning a psychopath is born with it. A sociopath is not born, but they are made. But that's a more difficult distinction to make than a lot of people make it out to be. So let's take ourselves through all of this, and we'll talk about each one of these that I've got listed up here for you to look at. And we can discuss whether, is there a difference here, or are they just a variation of the exact same thing? So let's start off here with the first thing, which is psychopath versus sociopath in terms of what do they suffer from? In other words, what do they have? Well, we do not have any diagnosis in psychology of psychopathy versus sociopathy. Okay, there isn't any difference between the two. That's not even specific terms. We use them. You'll find them in the DSM as far as psychopath being mentioned, but the actual diagnosis is antisocial personality disorder. Now, one of the problems is that the psychopath, like if you're looking at Hare's psychopathy checklist, doesn't exactly fit with everything with an antisocial personality disorder. But the basics right now are that you must qualify as an antisocial personality disorder first. And that's for both of them, whether you become a psychopath or a sociopath. So an antisocial personality disorder is someone who, from a young age, they at least during their teens must have exhibited conduct disorder or symptoms of conduct disorder, even if they weren't diagnosed with it. So they must have done things like, maybe harm animals, confronted others while, stealing from them, conning other people out of their goods and services, running away from home at a very young age, being truant from a very young age, doing other kinds of antisocial behavior. And by the way, I mentioned from a very young age, we do note that the younger that you start with a lot of these problems, the more likely it is to be lifelong issues, meaning that if you have significant conduct problems that look antisocial, okay, but we don't give you an antisocial personality disorder until you're an adult, 18 or older. But if you're a young child and you start exhibiting these things, so you're harming animals, you're running away from home, you are stealing things, you are, belligerent and harming other people, getting up in their face and shoving them and starting fights and things like that. If you're starting those things early on in life, much more likely to be lifelong, okay? And that's where people get the idea that a psychopath is likely to have started early. And we do know that those people who are lifelong antisocial personality disorders, they don't seem to get better. They don't seem to have any turnaround. They go to jail, they come out, they do the exact same thing over again. Those kinds of people usually started very early, and it's much harder to change. Some people argue that that's because they were born that way. Others argue, yeah, but if you're involved with a lot of antisocial people, maybe your parents have significant behavioral problems, maybe the community that you're in does, the neighborhood that you're in, okay? And this is, again, where we get to that argument. Is it nature or is it nurture, and what's going on? So let's go back through there. So let's just jump back in here. Look at this. So number one is both of them, whether you're an psychopath or a sociopath, the idea is that the diagnosis itself from the DSM is antisocial personality disorder. Then for a psychopath, the idea is that they completely lack empathy and they don't have a conscience. It does not bother them what they do. They don't have those internal controls that allow them to stop those behaviors that are negative. And the lack of empathy is a lack of what we call warm empathy. They often have cold empathy in the sense that they understand what you're thinking, they understand how you're behaving, and they understand how to use that against you. But that sense of, I feel bad about it, I'm guilty about it, I did something that I shouldn't have done, and I really feel, awful for you that something bad happened or that I did something bad, that's lacking. Really vitally important. That warm empathy is key for not engaging in problematic behavior. Okay. And again, sometimes that problematic behavior is actually harming someone, like beating them up. Sometimes it's harming them by taking advantage of them in some way. So you don't actually physically harm them, but you take their money or you do something else. And you don't feel bad about it because you're like, well, they should have known better, or they should have protected themselves, that kind of stuff. That's that lack of warm empathy. Now, the sociopath may lack that in a lot of situations, but the idea is that the sociopath has some empathy in some situations, meaning that they're more likely to have empathy towards those people who are really close to them. Maybe they're in a gang and they have really a lot of empathy for those particular people that they are close to, but no one else. That's kind of one of the differentiators between here. And that actually may be a better differentiator than this idea of whether you're born with it or not, which is our next one, which is the origins of the illness. Where does the illness come from? In other words, where do you get a psychopath versus a sociopath? The general idea is that, psychopaths are born with it, sociopaths are made based upon the environmental factors. But it's never that simple. And when we go back and look at that, and we look at, in fact, if you looked at my video on the psychology of evil, then you'll know that almost all evil, whether it's murdering, rape, or conning people out of their life savings, or embezzling, whatever it is, usually has a whole lot of factors involved in it. Okay, and one of the things that we've had, especially for those who are more likely to be very physically harmful to people, are an early life of child abuse and other things. So, you know, it would argue that even if you might be born with it, it needs some other environmental factors, things that are happening, family disruption, child abuse that happens to poverty, other things have to happen. And any one of those by itself doesn't lead to being a psychopath or a sociopath. They just set it up so it's more likely. And the more of those risk factors that you have, the more likely it is that you're going to have some problems. One of the risk factors is probably genetics. The problem is that we don't have it down in terms of exactly what are the genetics. That's the idea that, are you born with it or are you not? Okay. And we don't have, for example, there are brain scans, and we have brain scans from teenagers and even late childhood that suggest that there are brain differences between someone who's psychopathic and someone who's not. So, in other words, they are more likely to have a smaller or less active amygdala, which means that they don't kind of get the emotions behind that. They don't feel the same emotions that the rest of us feel. But even with those particular brain scans, we don't know if that goes back necessarily to childhood, or we know nothing about it in terms of, were you actually born with it? In other words, children are very plastic, meaning that they can change, their brains can change, they're able to modify based upon the environment. And if the environment's awful, then it's more likely to change towards that direction because it's adapting to that situation. So we don't know enough to say, yes, you're born with it, because the facts are that we don't have data to say this child is born and we can follow them all the way through and we know that they therefore are going to be a psychopath. We don't have that kind of information. And it's, again, not as simple as that. So that's probably not good. You're going to see it out there a lot. A lot of people will say, and I've seen psychologists, in fact, say this, where they'll say, well, the key is that one is born with it and the other's not. That's kind of how it came about in terms of why we gave it the name, but that doesn't mean because we gave it that name that's actually accurate. So we don't know that, because both are probably made. Is it possible that there's the group of people who have that genetic underpinning that make them at risk for it? Absolutely. In fact, there's almost no doubt that that's the case. But we can't tell you that early on as birth or even very young childhood. We don't have those brain studies. We don't know that yet. And it's clear that It's always a combination. It's never, ever just nature or nurture. It's always a combination of those things. Okay. So the next one is predisposition to violence. Now, again, the research isn't wonderful on this. I've got this because you're going to see this in the out there in on the internet a lot that the psychopaths are varied, meaning sometimes they're very violent, sometimes not. There's no doubt about that. There are certain warrior genes that come into play that make you more likely to be very violent, but there are other ones that don't. Okay, and there are a lot of psychopaths who are, they are CEOs. In fact, CEOs may have a higher percentage of psychopaths than most other in fact, even then, maybe in jail, but they don't do anything violent. What they do is that they do things that are maybe not all that ethical to do. They make money by exploiting others and things like that, but they're not directly violent. And then the idea was that the sociopath is high on that. Partly because the idea that they were more likely to belong within a group, maybe, again, a gang or within, the mob or something like that, more likely to be violent um, because they were kind of socialized that way. But again, this is not a clear distinction. How impulsive are they? The view was that sociopaths are impulsive and psychopaths are all over the place. Um, and one of the problems are, and again, in the next line, if you want to look on this chart here, is the behavior. And notice a lot of people will take a psychopath and break them up into type one, the unemotional, callous one. And keep in mind, unemotional doesn't mean they have no emotions. That means they don't really feel for anyone else. And then the impulsive risk-taking type. But if they're impulsive and risk-taking, then that's going to look at type two would look exactly like a sociopath would. Again, notice the problem, and it's this trying to define, are we having a psychopath and there's a couple different types, or is there really, do we name them two different things, a psychopath and a sociopath? Again, not that easy to differentiate between them. Okay. What's the criminal behavior like? Well, the idea is that the psychopath is more likely to scheme and plan, while the sociopath is more likely to be impulsive. They leave clues behind because they just do it and don't think about it. Again, this comes from the idea that they're more likely to be, if they're defined as a sociopath, within a social structure of some sort. They're within a group, a family, a cult, a gang, the mob, any of those kind of things, where they're around other people who are behaving that same way. So they're more likely then to just engage in that, maybe just do it without thinking because there's a lot of that peer pressure that goes on, versus the psychopath who may be within that group, but is still going their own way. Now, criminal predispositions. Well, again, we see this wide variety, and maybe one of the biggest differentiators between these in terms of criminal predispositions has to do with the how smart they are. IQ plays a big role in this. You're going to find that those people who are psychopathic but very, very smart are more likely to, make a killing in the stock market versus killing someone else. While those who are lower intellectual functioning are more likely to, get in bar fights, have problems, get put in jail. While again, the really smart ones are more likely to be conning you, get things out of you that way. So they don't directly harm you. And so the criminal predispositions may be slightly different as a result of that. Finally, the psychopath and their social relationships as compared to the sociopath. This may be our best one, and I've mentioned it at the very beginning. In other words, the psychopath may have lots of superficial relationships, but they don't really care about any of those. They may stay in a relationship as long as it benefits them. So, for example, if it's a male psychopath and they are married, they're often married multiple times, or and if they are not, they're having lots of affairs. And one of the big keys is to kind of feel like, how is that person serving me? Meaning that I may be married, and if that person is serving a purpose of providing cover for me, I'll stay married to them. Or if that person is especially attractive or high status in some way, I want to keep them on my arm because that looks really good. But it's that. They don't really have that deep feeling for them. Well, the sociopath is more likely to have a group of people that they really do have a feeling for. So anybody in the group, they will like, and they will actually may show some caring for. While those outside the group, that's who they're more likely to engage in that antisocial behavior with. So this actually may be really one of our better discriminators if there really is a difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. Is the idea of they have some conscience, they have some empathy, but it's only to a specific group, not to the general public. Well, the psychopath doesn't have that really towards anyone. They're maybe able to, look like they're very, charismatic and, good about interacting because they understand those, but they don't actually feel any of those inside. It's easier to identify those when you see their behavior over a long period of time with a lot of different people, or if you actually live with them, you then get to notice that. On the outside, it may be very, very difficult to note the psychopath because sometimes they appear to be really a loving, family person, but look to see are they using those people because they are beneficial to them. So, what does this come down to? Is there a difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? Well, maybe. Okay. We've defined them differently, but if you get back to type 1 and type 2 psychopaths, all of a sudden type 2 looks a lot like a sociopath. So there have been arguments as to whether there are really any differences, or are we just labeling on this spectrum that one end of the spectrum seems to maybe have a little bit of empathy, maybe a little bit of connection to others, maybe we can identify that they were they have a community around them that kind of, or a culture around them, or they, had parents around them who kind of had any social tendencies themselves, so they developed that way, meaning they were sociopaths, or were they at this other end, this group that doesn't really have any connections to anybody else, doesn't really feel any empathy, doesn't have much conscience at all, views those as weaknesses and that kind of stuff. That's more psychopathic. Right? So is it just one big spectrum? Probably. Is there an easy way to divide it and say this is the sociopath, this is the psychopath? No, there's not. Might they be useful terms in terms of helping us kind of say this person seems to be have some connections with some people, and it seems to be that they were brought up in an environment that made it more likely their antisocial behavior is due to that environment, versus this one seems to start so early that maybe it's something that's, more strongly related to some genetic underpinnings. Yeah, maybe that may be true. We may have that. But at this point, we don't have a good discrimination between the two as far as diagnostically so that we can actually label somebody clearly one versus the other. So it's important to notice that. And we talk about this even in my Psychology of Evil class. We talk about the differences between those two. And, and if we're talking about a sociopath, I want the people in class to define what that is. If they talk about a psychopath, I want them to define what that is so we can know what they're talking about and whether they believe it's, again, mainly, developed in someone, or is it mainly something that is more genetic basis. And again, is it more like we can see them having some empathy or some connection to some groups of people, but nobody outside the group, versus those people who have no real connections to anybody because they are only out for themselves and everything is transactional. So anyway, I hope that this has been helpful for you to kind of think about it. There is no absolute answer to this at this point. I will put in the description a couple of articles that might be helpful for you to go back and read about, is there really a difference between these and what some of the thoughts are on that. So if you like some of this content, go ahead and hit subscribe on this, and I will look forward to seeing you on another video.